We have to say that just as blacks were victims of this false racial superiority inspired by the false messaging in religion, the false idea or notion of who God is. And remember, I'm still really speaking on that verse, who is more unjust than he who lies against God, mentioned in the Qur'an. It's very easy for us to see ourselves as victims of that. But we also, if we're real, we have to say that those whites who also received that message, internalized that message, and went in the opposite direction, they are also victims of whoever put that message and that image together. We would be fools if we think that the average European coming out of Europe, these people were uneducated. These people were uncultured. These people had many problems like other human groups or all human groups. The average one of them did not have enough insight and foresight to put these kinds of ideas and images together to present them to the world. Meaning what? Someone that we can't really even put our thumb on, our finger on. We can just say some influence introduced Jesus Christ in the way that we are addressing right now. And when that particular presentation of him was given to the world, it had an effect on the mind of the white man as well. He also, just as we would internalize inferiority, he would internalize superiority. He would internalize his association with divinity. He would come into, not all of them, but many of them, and perhaps the majority, depending upon what time frame we're looking at, he would come into what was expressed by some of the black psychologists, maybe in the 80s and 90s, a God complex. He associated himself with divinity. He sees himself in the image of God, and therefore he becomes convinced that he is superior and that he has proximity, closeness to divinity. And as a consequence, he also has the possession of traits and qualities, just like you would associate, I repeat, something beautiful, visually beautiful, with beautiful qualities and traits internally. So if you see a beautiful person, you think they're smart and they're intelligent and they're nice, all of that. He becomes convinced that he possesses all of those qualities too, whether it is true or not. So this image is a mythological device. It's a device that puts us in non-reality, and that it suspends us. It keeps us suspended or locked in the context of falsehood. It keeps the black man in a certain type of falsehood, and it keeps the white man in a certain type of falsehood. And the one who really benefits from both falsehoods is the one who is behind or perpetuates or allows the perpetuation of that image to persist. Now, to be fair, we don't see that image as much in the world anymore. I have seen it in some black churches, but you don't see it anymore. Like you get these church leaders like Joel Osteen. You have the T.D. Jakes. I'm speaking of them particularly, but I'm also using them as types. That brand or that strand or that influence in the church movement in America, they've really done away with the images. And there's a lot that the African-American Muslims did to bring that about, because it was our movement, CRAE, the Committee for the Removal of All Images That Portray the Divine. I think I'm saying it correctly. That was an actual effort, one of the early efforts of Imam Muhammad, where we actually, city by city, went from church to church, telling them that this is savagery that you have. I'm summing up the message. And the CRAE movement was inspired by the verse in the Qur'an. What they translate, they tend to speak of it as a common word. O people of the book, come to a common word between us and you. And we worship none but God. We associate no partners with him, etc. And that some of us don't take lords from among others, meaning that we don't acknowledge that amongst your people, you have a Lord that's over us. That's essentially what the white Jesus is. They are saying, or they were saying in that imagery, that their race has a divine being. And we, the members of another race, another look, another set of features, we are to be under that image. We take that image as Lord. And God is saying in the Quran that this is not the balanced way. This is oppression of the human soul. But I'm repeating and I'm making plain right now, it's not just oppression on the soul of the one who is opposite the image, it is also a form of oppression for the one who is in that image, because it is just like it is putting us in a false reality of superiority, it is also putting him in a false reality. Putting us in a false reality of inferiority. It's putting him in a false reality of superiority. Both are false, because I said at the outset, all of us are created sons of Adam, servants of God, and there is no superiority of one group over the other. That's the scientific reality. Speaking of science, it should be known that there are efforts today, even in the scientific community, to advance this falsehood. See, the devil never stops. When you fight, you get hit, you maneuver. You don't just get hit and take it. You maneuver, you duck, you bob, you weave. The Satan is the same way. So the more we advance truth, the more he is attempting to advance falsehood. He wouldn't have introduced the falsehood if he wanted it to dissipate and be destroyed. So if he finds truth on the scene working against his falsehood, he's just going to bob and weave and restructure, reconsider, re-strategize to advance it. So we have books written now by respected intellectuals seeking to prove that at a genetic level, certain races are inferior to others. And all they're doing is they're serving as instruments of the devil himself. Okay? And we'll talk more about that later, inshallah. Because the biggest problem now, the biggest result is not just the fact that we internalize inferiority, that's false, and superiority, that's false. And there's a lot of details. I use the example of our women who perm their hair. And I also indirectly, and I'll say it sort of directly now, even the men among us who don't even like our women unless they perm their hair. See, all of this is self-hatred. If we internalize this self-hatred, if we internalize this sense of our being ugly, less than, of no value, of little esteem. See, a person with a poor self-concept, a poor self of identity, also has low esteem. They esteem themselves. They regard themselves as low. And we are what we think. So if we think ourselves to be lower than, less than, of lesser value, then we will again subconsciously, if not consciously, behave as if we have no value. We've already accepted defeat. We've already come into the expectation that we should be at a lower level than others. As a matter of fact, an argument can be made that in Black America, we celebrate our lowness. And that has been sold to us as a strategy. For example, it's very easy for us to say, oh, this is so if I have a real estate company, this is the #1 Black real estate company. If I have a magazine, well, this is the #1 Black magazine. But no other race does that. In other words, it's almost said, well, it's almost assumed, well, you can't compete with the big boys. You can't compete with the whites. So you're in a separate category. You're just in the category of the blacks. And your performance is to be rated against other blacks. We have this even in our masjids, the #1 Black masjid, the #1 Black church. No, the biggest Black church, the biggest Black high school, the biggest Black whatever, whatever. Grocery store. No, if we are going to do a particular work, if we're going to engage in anything, we should just be the best because we're human. And because we have the same human content, the same human potential, and we were created for the same purpose as all other humans, we want to compete with the best and brightest all across the planet Earth. So there is a ceiling, there is a sort of a limit already implanted in the psyche of so many of us. And this is true of our leaders. This is not just true of the average common person walking down the street. This is the orientation of those who would be leaders. But let's move on. Again, all of these things, I'm highlighting points. We're going to come back to more of it in detail as we go on, inshallah. And I like to keep these short. When I write it out, I'll say, well, it's a lot we're going to cover, but sometimes they end up being short. I want to circle this, or I end up wanting to keep it short. I want to circle this to a main point. Not only does the false idea of God, and again, I've only hinted upon some of the effects. Not only does it put us both in a false reality, in time, what it has done, it has weakened, it has regressed, it has brought about the retardation of our moral sense, our moral intelligence, our moral sense. Let's start with the racist first, who thinks himself to be superior. Racism is a form of ignorance, and it is the doorway to deeper levels of immorality. If I think myself to be superior because I am white, then I have a false sense of my value. My value is not rooted in my human content. My value is based upon how I falsely regard surface level features. And if I am not placing my value in my internal qualities, such as my character, such as my intelligence, I'm just assuming that I have these things by virtue of the fact of I'm associating it with colors and features, etc., then chances are I'm not going to invest in, I am not going to cultivate, I am not going to think and think twice to consider and reconsider the very nature of my internal life and existence. Life and existence. I have a false sense of my value. On the flip side, if I have, look what has happened in the history of those of us who were revolutionary in our thinking. We came into a false sense of black power. We said, oh, the whites have the power, the whites have this. Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud. And again, we lost sight of the fact that our superiority or that our value is in our humanity. And if my value is in my humanity, then that ultimately means whatever power I possess potentially and whatever power I actualize in reality is based upon that human value. And if I know that, I can respect that value and build upon that value. But if I root my value in, again, my features, then I'm building upon, what do you call it, a sandy surface. Like Allah says in the Qur'an, the one they built the house on the brink of sand, on a not solid ground, but sand itself that's crumbling and about to fall. And we know that in order for my humanity to grow and to prosper, in other words, when I'm saying my humanity, I'm saying my intelligence, my creativity, what I can produce, it has to have a moral foundation. But false supremacy, either black supremacy or white supremacy, black inferiority, white inferiority, even, it opens me up to an immoral frame. It opens me up to a frame of viewing myself and viewing the world that doesn't rely on moral strength. So I'll give you an example of this. If we study most of the Black Power movements, many of the leaders in the spirit in the leadership was socially conscious, but not morally authentic, not morally aware. These were not really like religious movements. And one of the main things that broke into or that allowed for these movements to be destroyed was the weak moral fiber of many of the leaders and many of the members. This is even true of like movements in the Nation of Islam. By the time we get to the late 60s, early 70s, many of the people were coming into the Nation of Islam not because of the message. They saw the airplanes and the stores, and they saw the farmland. They were just attracted to the material achievements and the fact that, yeah, this is black power, let's join. They were not people searching for God in their core necessarily. I'm not saying this is true of all of them, but this is for example, Imam Muhammad, he addressed how this was a change in the spirit of the nation. When he was a boy in the 30s, these were people who literally just believed that these teachings were real, and they were devoted to God even though they had an idea that we don't accept, they were moved by a moral force. Later on, the influence differed. So I repeat what I said. My humanity has to have a moral foundation and a moral frame in which to express itself, in which to live. And if we don't have the moral frame, we will be subject to immorality, to put it very simply. False supremacy opens me up to an immoral life, and it opens me up to uh, once I open up to immorality and an immoral life, everything about me has the possibility to break down. So let me give some more examples. Look how immoral the white supremacist has been. The white supremacist is convinced of his superiority off of a false idea, and that same false superiority makes him ugly in terms of his moral character. So he doesn't feel bad when he destroys a life, when he takes a life, when he denies the rights of another person, when he denies the human value and mistreats another member of humanity that's not of his race. So his false sense of superiority has clearly degraded him morally.